Hello. Nice. Hello, everyone. My name is Joydeep and I am the Director of AI and Innovations in BRIDGEi2i. As a part of my job, I often need to interact with enterprises and organizations who are keen to incorporate AI into their daily and normal business cycles. They're keen to adopt AI and they're willing to understand the benefits of AI. Let's try to understand why that is so. So essentially, AI is part of our daily lives already. So we hear about AI all the time. AI is all around us. It's omnipresent. It's supposed to be taking over the world. Pretty much anything that you think of, there's some AI flavor or AI component added to that. These are a few of the news snippets that were like common headlines and became like quite talking points about what AI can do, what are the features of AI, where did AI fail, where did AI not fail, what is so spectacular about AI. So you keep on hearing about the word AI all the time. So it's not unusual that businesses will have this inclination to explore what AI can do for them, how can they leverage that. So that's one side of the spectrum. But businesses equally face another dilemma. So the other side of the story is that often people from the industry, or at least the analytics industry, they feel, or the kind of message that gets propagated is that AI is nothing but analytics repackaged in a different form using different jargons, different terms, but the underlying core component is essentially the same. So it's whether you call it AI, machine learning, deep learning, the underlying components that we get out of that, it's all the same, and essentially there's not much difference in terms of the actual impact or the benefit compared to what we have been doing in conventional analytics for the past 10 to 15 years in the least. So where do we stand on that, and how do we differentiate that, and is there any substance to AI as such? So what we really want to explore about that is one concept called the AI hype cycle. So there's definitely a lot of benefits and improvements that we have seen about it, but like any nice thing, what really happens is that you tend to see a lot of hype around AI. And I'll just deconstruct whatever we call as this hype cycle a bit for you so that we can understand as to what exactly creates a hype cycle, what are the components of that, and how does it determine what enterprises see and what essentially comes out of it. So essentially, anything that happens, you see some progress happening, and then at some point in time, you see some breakthrough innovation that is like quantum jump in terms of capabilities or ability to solve a problem in a new way that comes around. So you once in a while you see this thing happening, that there's a big jump in your abilities overall. And then what really happens is that for some time after that, there's a period of incremental improvements and innovations based on that big discovery or invention that happened. If you have to relate it to our current cycle that we are living in, this big jump possibly can, there can be many such jumps, and hype cycles are complicated things. There are many hype cycles, nested hype cycles in between. But one really big improvement or discovery that stands out is the point when people figured out that deep learning can be utilized well to solve certain image and computer vision problems. So before that, we had this era where we had to have handcrafted solutions for computer vision to understand images, what they're talking about. At some point in time, a few years back, humanity understood that we can have deep learning algorithms that can do a far better job of understanding images and videos and stuff like that without having to have those special handcrafted solutions. So that was a big jump that created a lot of excitement, and subsequent to that, we had this era of where we were trying to apply deep learning and similar tools and techniques to a variety of different problems, which is typically this period of incremental innovation. what inevitably happens after that is that at some point in time, you generate some hype around that. So people go ahead of their curve and try to make predictions, futuristic claims that are unsubstantiated, and you start developing some hype around what is the real capability. So if you look at it, we have the real capability that we can see over here, and at some point in time, inevitably the hype creeps in. Over time, if you look at it, the real capability expands at like a manageable rate, which is whatever can be achieved through proper research and studies. The hype, though, keeps on expanding exponentially, to the point that at one point in time, you have the burden of the hype is so overbearing that it completely overshadows whatever the real capabilities of that particular technology or stream is. This is essentially the point where the weight of the hype tries to bring down the general disillusionment about the possibilities. What really happens is that when an organization or enterprise looks at it, he doesn't see only the green part of it. He sees both the red parts and the green parts, and then he can't differentiate which is the hype, which is the real possibility, and then he tries to pick up something, do something, and generally gets disillusioned when he picks up one of those hyped things which doesn't really work in real life. It's not new. We have seen multiple hypes around AIs. So AI as by nature of it, tends to become like general. It tends to create a lot of hype in a general human consciousness. So that's typically what we mean by hype cycles. So what does it lead us to? The other thing that's important to note over here is the fact that we are essentially having two distinct hype cycles. So we are in this specific place in history right now where we had one big data hype cycle that is kind of past. So we have spent some time on there, but now it's in a mature state right now, the big data hype cycle. The AI hype cycle is still in a state where there's a lot of hype that can still get deflated as time passes, which kind of places us in a very interesting position that a platform to create all these AI solutions is available with us. The actual solutions, we still need to understand which solutions can deliver results, which will be the robust solutions, and which are the ones that will turn out to be mere hypes. How do we proceed from this? So essentially, the key here for any business will be, it's simple. We have to determine what is the hype around AI versus what is the real substance and how do we differentiate that. And then once we have identified what's the real substance, what AI can do for us really, understand what are the real possibilities of AI. So that's the real thing, real crux about making sure that AI as a technology in general lives up to its promise, and we don't just run behind the hype while ignoring the real substance. To understand, to differentiate the hype and the real thing, possibly it's good to take a step back and see what a digital organization really means and what are the digital transformation levers that we have. And post that, what we can really understand is that how can we generalize AI in terms of what it can do for enterprises and compartmentalize that into a few specific action items. So that's what essentially I'm going to do. By the way, if you have any questions, or possibly you can ask them right away, or you can reserve them towards when we are done with the presentation. Okay, so if we look at the digital transformation levers, so what are the four cornerstones of a digital organization? Essentially, if you think about it, one is complete visibility. So we need to have like visibility on what data is available, how they're available, where they're coming from, what's the source, all of that. That's number one. Second, what we really need is that we need insights based on the right kind of decisions. So we need to have the decision-making process based on insights driven from data. Third is a process effectiveness, where essentially some of the insights are driving the efficiency and effectiveness of the process. So you just don't generate insights, you do something about it also. And fourth, enablement. The point is, how do you consume those insights? How do you essentially understand what is being suggested? So intelligent interactions and immersive experience. So when you combine all of these things, essentially that's when you can get what we are calling a digital enterprise, and what digital transformation can do for an enterprise or an organization. Now, if we were to focus our thoughts on these things, it gives us the 4 AI actions, or AI accelerators as we call them. One is Watchtower, the second is we're calling a recommender, third is optimizer, and the fourth is a converser. So a Watchtower is nothing but a system that essentially looks after everything. It's in general what AI is supposed to be, that a system that can essentially look over everything, understand how things are progressing, how things are interacting with each other, how things are impacting each other, and then create alerts, summarize information, do all that kind of stuff. That's what we call as Watchtower. What we call as recommender is essentially making recommendations, but not just in the pure sort of recommendation as what we understand as collaborative filtering and stuff like that. So what it also means is that it will understand the requirements based on the signals produced by the user and incorporate those signals and make more real-life, real-time, flexible, more relevant recommendations. That's primarily what we mean by recommender. Optimizer, again, it's like many business problems can be classified as optimization problems. There is nothing new about optimization, but when we talk about optimizer, it's like you have a multitude of different techniques, tools and techniques available to optimize certain things. How do you determine which tools and techniques to use? How do you determine, based on your data, what are the tools and techniques that will be most relevant or useful or valid? So that's where optimizer comes into picture. And then finally we have converser, which essentially is telling us about how do we essentially interact with the systems, how do I pass on my instructions to these systems, and how do we essentially consume the outputs that this system is throwing and feeding it back to us. If we want to go into a bit more depth about all of this, so essentially if we just talk about watchtowers and recommenders, it may not mean a lot. So what we really want to do is that we want to go into a bit more depth about it as to what really comprises of these actions, and then possibly tie them back with a use case where we can see a real life practical business use case where we'll see applications of all of the solutions and see how AI is transforming a more conventional business process to a more digitized, smart, intelligent process. So that's the main idea of it, and that's what I'm going to cover for the rest of this presentation. Just to reiterate the fact that if you have to think of any specific AI actions for a business, it will possibly be either one or more, a combination of one or more than one of these AI accelerators that we've spoken about. So to go a bit more into details of the Watchtower. So when we say Watchtower, the general idea is that it's this system that's looking over everything, understanding everything. It's this big brother watching over you and trying to make sense of the process, how things are running, and if something is not running well, capture that and flag it to you. How does it happen? So what we are really saying is that Watchtower can come in 2 different flavors. One is what we can call a KPI Watchtower. The other is what we can call a surveillance watchtower. A KPI watchtower, in essence, it's a simple thing to understand. And so it's essentially nothing but a digital dashboard plus intelligence built on top of it. Surveillance watchtower is a pool of signals, a signal pool, and then you have intelligence added on top of that. To go into KPI Watchtower, so we have been working with dashboards and reports and all of that. So how is a KPI Watchtower different from the standard dashboards that we're working with? So what essentially we're talking about is that KPI Watchtower is nothing but a BI system on a structured data, plus a few components, which essentially is what we're calling as the intelligence on top of the dashboard system. What are those things? So on a BI system, first of all, can we add unstructured data to it? So any BI system producing reports or generating dashboards essentially is doing that on structured data. You have your SQL databases, you work on that, you generate reports out of it, and that gives you what your BI system is generating. Can we add unstructured data? That's the most easy part. I mean, that's the most obvious part of it about adding AI, is that can we add unstructured data on top of that and create something sensible out of this and summarize information? Can we add our textual data, text notes, images, videos, sensor information coming from sensors, all of that? So adding that is one component to it. What do we essentially end up doing with all of these BI systems and reports? So a typical business function might be generating about about a few hundred to a few thousand reports based on how big the organization is and how big the department is. One key part is that trying to figure out is everything in place, and if something is not in place, what is causing that deviation? What is causing that thing to fall out of that place? So can we have an automated root cause analysis built into the system? How do we do that? That's a separate thing. But adding that adds another layer of intelligence, which removes one of the main key human interactions from that. Third is, okay, when do we go in for the root cause analysis? So some of your KPI, for example, is supposed to lie in certain thresholds, and it's going beyond that. That essentially triggers detection mechanism that what is causing that. But essentially, if we can have a smart anomaly detection on top of that, which essentially is tracking all the KPIs in there across their interlinkages and interdependencies, we can determine those deviations without having to have a human eye go through them. So that way we have the deviations coming out automatically, and once the deviation is out, we have the root causes determined for that also. Finally, can we have something called a smart narrative? So if you have a few hundred reports being thrown at you, how do you summarize that and create a one-page, two-page executive summary, highlighting the key points to be noted from those list of 500 reports or a few thousand reports, and generate that in a human consumable format? So if we can have these components built on top of a standard dashboard system, you pretty much have all the intelligence that's required to make business sense out of it without having to have a ton of analysts sitting there and interpreting your reports. Moving ahead, what essentially do we mean by a surveillance watchtower? So the concept is simple. So you have a large number of signals coming into your what we can call a signal pool. Signals can be something like thrown out by the sensors in your industrial system, the sensors, maybe a few thousand sensors built into your factories, machines, or it can be generated through human activities. For example, when one of your credit card consumers is swiping his card, it's generating a signal. So the transaction amount, the transaction location, the transaction type, the difference, the gap between two successive transactions. So all of these are essentially signals that are being generated by the process, which essentially comes into what we call the signal pool. What do we do with the signal pool? The end idea is that you essentially understand the signal pool, have this intelligence built around that, and then once you understand that, you can automatically figure out the deviations. For example, a fraud is being committed. A human person looking at the data could possibly understand that, okay, this transaction is out of line with whatever this person typically does. But rule-based fraud detection mechanisms that we have right now can possibly tend to make it oversensitive, which might result in customer frustration. So once we have a signal pool, what is our intelligence doing? So there are multiple things that a human needs to do. One is process determination. So when a signal is being generated, can we figure out what is the normal behavior of that? How do we model that using mathematical models? What kind of mathematical models has to be used? Whether we have to use mean reverting model just for the sake of it, diffusion model, some kind of model with jumps built into it. That determination of the process itself is a process of intelligence that has to be done by a human, which can pretty well become a part of this intelligent system. How do you understand the interlinkages and interdependencies between the signals that are being generated? Which signals are dependent on which other signals? What is their causality relations like? Which bunch of signals are impacted together? All of that, so that understanding of this dependency structure across those few hundred or few thousand signals, that's the second dimension of the intelligence that should be built. The other crucial aspect of intelligence is like how do we determine the data history or length of data history required. For all of this calibration of the processes, you determine the business process, the mathematical process. To calibrate that, you need to use data. For that, you need to understand how long a data has to be used from the historically observed length of data. Can we add intelligence there? Finally, do we have a smart threshold determination mechanism? You cannot have rule-based thresholds, flat thresholds, or something like that because processes keep on changing. And if you don't follow that change, you essentially will possibly end up generating false triggers or won't generate a trigger when a trigger has to be generated. So if you have to break it down, can we add these components which essentially then adds up on top of your signal pool to generate what we're calling as a surveillance watchtower? So beyond the watchtower, there are the other components. The primary component of that is what we do about recommendation. So recommendation, if we talk about it, it's nothing but how we essentially map a universe of entities, which can be customers or businesses or something else. How do we map a universe of entities to which a recommendation can be made to a pool of entities, of recommendable entities? And how do we make the connections? Where recommender works on AI accelerator is like, can we do it in an adaptive real-time format? So what do we mean by that? As individuals or customers, we are generating signals all the time through possibly the items we pick up in a retail store, our online activities, our browsing history, the way we are chatting with the converser or chatbot. Can we pick up these things and filter out the signals that a customer is providing and pick up those signals, pass them to a recommendation framework, and then the recommendation framework can understand those and make the recommendations more relevant based on those. So what that really consists of is that, I'm sorry? Okay. So what that really consists of that is that we have our conventional recommendation techniques, which really works on static data in the back end, which can be used to generate recommendations and store them. But subsequently, can we use graph-based recommendations where you can essentially make sure that the filter, so the signals you've filtered, feeds into that and generates more relevant recommendations, or understand which of those pre-computed recommendations are not good enough for the purpose and alter them based on the new signals picked up. It can also essentially handle issues like, for example, most recommendation systems won't be able to handle something called a long tail, that you essentially keep on churning a few recommendations over and over again, whereas ignoring a vast majority of items lying there, some of which might be as well equally recommendable. So can we address some of these issues of adaptive recommendation, long tail recommendation, along with our conventional recommendation mechanisms? So that's our second AI accelerator that essentially is about recommendation in a more smarter manner. The third one, again, it's the optimizer. We have spoken about it. So there are a number of business cases that requires optimization as a process, as tool, as an enabler. So what we really have in any optimization problem is that the problem is essentially about how do we solve or how do you find some optimal point in a multi-dimensional search space. That typically translates into normal business problems, but what really happens is that you can have multiple conventional approaches, stochastic gradient descent, stuff like that, which are typically can be resource intensive, but will have more certainty of finding an optimal solution. You have your meta heuristics, genetic algorithms, particle swarm optimization, ant colony optimization, stuff like that, which are good enough for most practical purposes, but you have the problem of determining when to stop and get an optimal solution. So you typically have the optimization techniques well sorted out. What really can be useful and what really needs some intelligence and what needs human inputs right now is that based on the data type and all of that, how can we automatically determine what kind of optimization techniques will be more suited for what kind of problems? Can we also essentially, when using meta heuristics, can we also figure out what shall be a stopping criteria to get a near optimal solution? So if you're in a business problem, and if you're using genetic algorithms, and if you have gotten certain level of optimal solution, is it good enough to stop the process and come up with that solution? Or do we need to go ahead and run the process for some more time and see if we can generate some better optimization? So how do you make the cutoff? So these are the other areas where potentially AI can help us and get a more AI-driven optimization solution in place for business problems. Finally, where do we go from here? The last pillar is a pillar that kind of binds all of these multiple angles and accelerators together. So we have our watchtowers and recommenders and optimizers, but to get the general AI inbuilt into it, we also need to have this element of how do we converse with all of these processes. And that's where the fourth accelerator of converser comes into play. So it's essentially about, it's about a lot of things. It's about chatbots, it's about conversational AI, it's about augmented reality and virtual reality, it's about gamification. But most of it, it's about how do we interact with our AI systems, how can we essentially talk to, say, an Alexa or a Google Assistant and ask them to generate a sales report for you that shows the sales performance for certain regions, for certain brands, for certain specific time points, and get that entire immersive experience out of it. It's also about, for example, if you're talking to a chatbot, can the chatbot understand your requirements based on your questions? Can the chatbot understand the mood you are in? And first of all, use the adaptive recommendation process to generate more relevant recommendations for you based on the chat conversation you are having. And then once you've had that, can it make the recommendation to you at the most optimal point in time? So it is essentially binds all the other accelerators together into one standard mode of consumption. Now, how does this, I mean, a lot of this is a bit conceptual and theoretical in nature, but how does it essentially tie back to a real life problem and use case? So what we can really see is that for a one of the standard problems that we are dealing with right now is a sales strategy recommendation for sales agents. So we have a problem we have like this huge army of salespeople for a fairly big tech company. What the need is that they essentially go and visit their clients, but they're not always updated with what is the most optimal strategy that they can work with their clients to drive better sales effectiveness. One thing that the need is that the need smart information gathering and intelligent alerting. You have multiple feedbacks from multiple sales agents in terms of the sales feedbacks, notes and all of that, which come in speeches, voice notes, text data. How can we gather information from all of that and filter that and find a few strategies which have been useful, have been worked out, and have worked in the past or haven't worked in the past, as well as other sales and related information, and how can we capture all of that and have it in one place. So that's number one. So that's the Watchtower functionality, which is crucial to the solution. Second is recommendations. So once you've gathered all this information, filtered the relevant information, how can we recommend a strategy to a salesperson and tell him that, okay, fine, you're working with this client has done this in the past, this is his interest, try out strategies A, B, and C in that order with this client that should enhance the probability of your sales happening eventually. So that's where the adaptive recommendation piece comes into picture. Optimization comes into picture as we see that there are multiple levels of optimization across dimensions of sales, the sales agents, the dimensions of deals, the organization, all of that. And finally, it's a sales agent on the run. He's essentially on the street, on the roads. He needs a way to have a conversational approach to get the engine or get the outputs from the engine as well as place his requirements. How do we essentially build the envelope around that and build the conversational layer? Will essentially be the fourth accelerator that brings all of these things together. So that's essentially the solution was this bridge funnel, which is being displayed outside in the booth, and you can meet us outside in the booth to see more about bridge funnel. So I guess that's my presentation. So I'll stop here.